Bom dia. People are still a little bit of asleep right now. Bom dia. There we go. That's the spirit of dialogue that we're looking for. I can tell that Thursday night is a very big night in Sao Paulo because the auditorium is a little bit less full than yesterday. So I imagine people went out dancing samba until very late, but I'm sure that people will be trickling in as the morning progresses. I have to say I got to appreciate your intangible cultural heritage of barbacão. And I am ready to move to Brazil and stay here forever and eat that every day. So thank you very much for sharing your wonderful cultural heritage and the incredible hospitality of the Brazilians. We have greatly appreciated it. Today we are going to spend a very exciting couple hours together where we are going to talk about very concretely how AI can be harnessed to address challenges related to environmental management. We are going to talk about algorithmic bias in different areas, including journalism and the judicial system in Brazil, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and beyond. We are going to talk about the future of learning and AI, and how AI is transforming how we learn, how we think about learning, and how we need to reskill and upskill our communities in order to ensure that we can engage proactively with developing the AI of tomorrow. We are going to talk about AI and culture, how AI is changing the way in which we think about creative industries, cultural heritage, and cultural diversity. And we are going to, lastly, very concretely, talk about how AI, following all these discussions, can be harnessed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. But before that, and before we do a deep dive, I'm very pleased to introduce Nicolas Miaé, who's the co-founder and president of the Future Society, who will talk about, for us, one of the fundamental areas in which UNESCO is looking at, the ethical dimensions of artificial intelligence, and specifically how to address these ethical dimensions by engaging in an omni-stakeholder approach citizens in talking about these issues and concrete solutions that we will co-develop to address these issues and create the AI of tomorrow through different platforms, including our AI Civic Forum, with whom the Future Society is a partner. So Nicolas Miaé, please come to the stage.
Bom dia. Bom dia. Thank you. Good morning. Sorry, my Portuguese is very weak. By the end of my stay in Puerto Rico, having learned a bit more of samba, I should get better. But for now, I'm going to have to address you in English. Sorry for that. I could do French as well. So thanks a lot and congratulations to UNESCO, to Cetic, to NIC, to CGI, and all the organizers of this important regional forum. These kind of exercises are critical, in my view, to advance the good and the ethical governance of AI, which is to capture the upsides. And there are so many upsides, and to minimize the downsides. And you'll see today, that's one point I'm going to try and bring, that the opportunities and the challenges of the rise of AI are inextricably connected. There won't be any free lunch. And as a result, the good governance of AI is that is turn towards establishing the infrastructure of trust to enable capturing these upsides and minimizing the downsides. Can we put on the slides up, please? Thank you. So who are we, the Future Society? It's a big name, it's a big claim, it's a big slogan. But yes, this is what it is about. It's about building the Future Society. It's really about designing the new kind of social contracts to help build this Future Society. It's no less than that. The AI revolution, the emerging technology revolution, is one which forces us to redesign some of our social contracts in a way that acknowledges the fact that our societies are growing in interdependence. We're deeply interdependent and globally interdependent. So we are a non-profit, independent, global think and do tank, which mission is really to advance the governance, particularly the global governance of AI and other emerging technologies. We do that by and through an innovative cocktail of rather traditional think and do tank-ish stuff, spanning policy research, advisory services to governments, international relations, and other actors, educational and leadership development programs, a lot of summits and convenings where we deploy some of our collective intelligence methodologies, and I'll focus on one of these projects, which is this AI Civic Forum, which we're envisioning in partnership with UNESCO to support this standard-setting instrument on AI ethics in a way that is participatory and inclusive. And so we were created in 2014, initially at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And now we are a 501c3 present in different countries. We're a fully remote, global think and do tank with people around the world. Small team, but dedicated team. And we work with many organizations, including UNESCO, including OECD, and other, including universities. Myself, I'm a teacher as well. I teach the governance of AI at various universities, including at Sciences Po in Paris. So, one thing that is really critical is that there is no single agreed upon definition of what AI is about. And to anchor our conversation this morning, I'm going to put that one on our table, okay? And because I think that it reflects what is really new and novel within the digital revolution on AI. AI is not falling from the sky. It's really emerging from the ground of digital. And what is new is that we are in a world which is increasingly big data driven. And sorry for the translators, it's going to be a bit of a long definition, but I'll go step by step. It's really big data driven, machine learning centric, complex, socio-technical, algorithmic systems, I'll come back on that, powered by high-performance, scalable computing. We, humans, have been dealing with complex socio-technical systems for a long time. The governance of the internet is a governance of a complex socio-technical system. Is the governance of a complex socio-technical algorithmic system. What is an algorithm? It's a set of instructions. If this, then that. When my grandmother cooks a good recipe for a cake or a bœuf bourguignon, it's a recipe is an algorithm, is a set of instructions. And so what is not new is in the governance of AI, dealing with complex socio-technical algorithmic systems. We have proven already our capability to do that. What is new is that they're increasingly big data driven and machine learning centric. And the problem that the ethical questions that this poses are big and plenty. Machine learning algorithms, particularly deep neural networks and deep learning crossed with reinforcement learning, are black boxes. They lack explainability, they lack transparency. They are not intelligent. They're stupid, but very powerful statistical models. So we have to govern a complex socio-technical system powered by powerful but extremely stupid statistical modeling. And big data. Well, so big data is a phenomenon within the digital economy which is driven by two very important trends which are potentially very oppressive to the individual. One is the laws of network effects. The other one is the law of ultra return to scale. The combination of network effects and ultra return to scale leads us to a digital economy where you have only one Facebook, not two. You have only one Alibaba in China, not two. In other words, it drives us to a world of oligopolistic dynamics. And this leads to a series of asymmetries of power, asymmetries of information. Now, this combined with the fact of putting black boxes at the center of our managerial table brews into very dangerous cocktail. Very promising too, because these systems are high performance, but very dangerous too. Now, you and we have covered over the past day these main challenges of ethics. Okay, so I don't need to spend hours on that, but I want just to cover a few points here. Obviously, if it's big data driven, there is a risk on privacy. Why? Well, because we need to let go of our data, particularly the personal data, to let these algorithms run what they have to run and extract prediction and optimizations. And we're shifting into a world where correlation is the new gold. It's not causation anymore, it's correlation. So the certainty of the decision is limited. It's probabilistic correlative. Well, probabilistic correlative obviously imprisons us into the past. If it's big data, it's data from the past. So again, it's something, and that's the next big point, that if we are relying on big data from the past, whatever bias have been embedded in that data remains and is carried into the future. That's the famous garbage in, garbage out. And we know that because of lack of capacity, lack of digital capacity, or statistical base nationally, regionally are weak and weaker in emerging and developing countries naturally because of lack of capacity. So what are we building upon and how are we dealing with this massive risk of algorithmic bias? But again, algorithmic bias with at the center of the table black boxes. And that takes me to, well, asymmetry of information I've already covered. Obviously, if we have black boxes to deal with, there is a lack of explainability and transparency over the decisions which are made. And that can be problematic. How can you refuse to someone a credit at a certain rate based on a black box and not explain to him or her why he or she is not getting the credit to buy the house, to buy the instruments for their shop? That's a big thing. We know that we live in a society where credit is very important. Obviously, if we have black boxes at the center of the table, we have massive security threats, cyber security threats, and dangers in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of choice. If it's big data-driven, machine learning-centric systems, the ways in which we express our ability to mobilize our free will to make choices while in parallel being recommended by big platforms, how we buy stuff, where we go, to the restaurant, who we meet, obviously freedom of choice is impacted. Not to talk, obviously, about massive challenges in terms of automation of labor. Yes, AI systems will complement humans, will help us make better decisions. We're talking here about automated decision-making, support to decision-making. But at the crossroad between automated decision-making and support to decision-making, it's not only complementing humans, it's substituting humans too. Not necessarily at the level of the job, but certainly at the level of the tasks. But jobs are made of a series of tasks. So let's not be naive too. And the people are not naive, so we have a challenge there. Now, I want to focus on two meta challenges. One is that these ethical challenges, these ethical risks are connected with each other. And they're in tension. And yes, there is a tension between what AI can provide in terms of access to basic services, access to healthcare, access to education, access to food, access to transportation on the one hand, and the risks in terms of privacy, bias, and control. A farmer deep down in India or in Brazil in need of a lower access to capital is going to be potentially okay with putting at the center of the credit scoring black boxes that are not capable of measuring the granularity of his or her risk, but on an aggregate is giving something good. So on an aggregate, it's going to potentially enhance access to credit while potentially risking enormous mistakes and discriminations over cases and cases and cases. And that's the same problem in terms of access to justice. Criminal justice, how can we measure the risk of recidivism? How can we use, as it is even, I think, in this country now, how can we use AI to make sure that we predict better the risk of recidivism? Well, you could say, well, let's not do that until the algorithms are not ready, of course. But on the other hand, giving the example of the US, in the United States of America, there are 2.3 million people behind bars. Okay? Today, as I'm speaking. There are over 3 million people who make the journey in and out of jail every year. So these cases need to be processed. How many judges do we have? How much time do we give each judge to focus on one particular case? So on the one hand, we would like, and we think that these algorithms can help make better decisions, can help support judges in delivering justice at scale. But on the other hand, we know that in so doing, we risk what I said before, and in that case, lack of due process or massive biases. So these ethical dimensions are connected. These challenges are in tension. And they are in tension in a world where this AI revolution is increasingly global and requires global coordination. And that's why the mandate that UNESCO has to develop this standard-setting instrument is in a way a mandate to develop a universal standard-setting instrument, addressing global challenges. But we know that for many, the universal means oppression, means oblivion. And you see here one logo of the Universal. It's a private company, yes, it's a movie-making production company. I was born and raised in Paris, France, and for us in France, when we see this logo of Universal, we are afraid. We're afraid of this logo taking away our cultural diversity. So for many in a world which is dominated by large multinational digital platforms, the Universal which we need to invent, if it's not done properly, can be made in a way that really diminishes and destroys the very local. So it's really about balancing out the very universal with the very local. Otherwise, people are going to distrust the universal. They are going to not want the universal. And we cannot, at this point, really afford it. Our planet, our common ship, is in danger in so many ways. It's upon us to invent this universal governance, but in a way that honors and respects the local. And the local, again, in a way that responds to the trajectory that has been there for over now 300 years. The global is still led by international organizations or international relations. International. The nation states, the sovereign still prevails. We would want to do away with that. Okay, I think we cannot do that. We have to deal with that, and UNESCO is a good example of that. It's a good example of an international organization which places at the center nation states who want to work together and yet is willing to involve in a conversation other actors, civil society, universities, indigenous people, many other people who are part of nation states but have a different voice. So articulating this omni stakeholder participation and governance that the Additional Director General Moise mentioned yesterday is something that is very important. And so when people disregard multilateralism, disregard multi-stakeholderism, and I want to tell them that, well, we should probably stop asking every day what UNESCO can do for us, and ask a little bit more what we can do for UNESCO. The same applies to the OECD, the same applies to any regional organizations because we need them. They might not be perfect, but we really need them. And those who have a culture which is deeply rooted in multi and omni-stakeholderism are very important in the age of AI because of the ethical dimensions that I mentioned right before. There are up to date, 80 ethical principles or list of ethical guidelines which have been produced over the past years. We know that UNESCO, and we're going to support that, is embarking on a journey to add on that construct with this standard setting instrument. We know, and we've been very involved at the Future Society with the OECD to develop these AI ethics principles, or the AI principles, which have now become the G20 principle. And we have also been involved in another example, which is the IEEE. And why I'm insisting on these three examples? The OECD has a mandate and a focus on economic development and cooperation. And yes, we need to see how we can align AI principles with this mandate of economic development. UNESCO has a mandate which is critical. Education, science, technology, culture, well, that's one of the keys to get that global governance regime in place that respects the local. So these are two international organizations working together, trying to complement each other based on their mandates. And then the third one, the IEEE, which you may not know, which to me is a very important example of global ethical principles, but it's a professional organization which gathers over 420,000 engineers. So it's not a national or international community, it's a community of practitioners. You've got here engineers, practitioners who are willing to step forward and say, we as engineers, under the roof of national and international regulation, what are we willing to do to align our designs, to align our developments of engineering systems with AI in a way which is ethical. And so, in a way, as an example, this combination, this triptych of OECD, UNESCO, and IEEE represents, in my view, the kind of things that we need. It's not sufficient, but that's the kind of thing that we need. In a sea of other actors. And we celebrate the fact that private companies regional organizations, local organizations, even cities are stepping forward and saying, these are our ethical guidelines. I think it's important. It's a movement that needs to be respected and celebrated. Well, there are convergences across these principles around 5 key principles. One is transparency. Second is justice and fairness. Third is non-maleficence. Fourth is responsibility or accountability. And 5 is privacy. But we also know that there are many limits to these AI ethics guidelines. One is that precisely there's a lack of clarity with terminology. What do we mean by accountability? Is it the same as explainability, traceability, auditability? No, the envelopes of each of these concepts partially overlap, but not totally. And so there is a diversity which can lead to a bit of confusion. Second, very important, lack of geographic diversity. You'll see in my next slide how blatant that lack is. And third, very important, lack of civic engagement. Most of these ethical guidelines are the fruit of very knowledgeable, very committed experts. We need them. We respect them. I'm one of them. But we need to go beyond. The AI revolution is so systemically complex and so high impact across our social contracts that we need to move way beyond that. Otherwise, we'll have more yellow vest movements. We'll have more movements of rebellion where citizens get out in the street and say, we don't want that. We're not part of this. This is not my world. So these are the 3 main limits of these ethical guidelines. Well, as I said, the geographical distribution is rather limited. This is maybe not the latest in terms of up-to-date diagram or map, but you can see here that it's rather the global north, Western world issuing this guideline. Is it bad? No. Is it sufficient? Well, certainly not. And it's not sufficient because remember that these ethical dimensions are in tension. Access versus privacy. Well, and the problem of access to basic services across Africa or even Brazil is a very, very important point. It's less of a problem in France or the US. It is a problem, but maybe less of a problem. And as I said, increasingly citizens are demanding that their voices be heard in those processes. Be it in Algeria, in Chile, in France, or in Hong Kong, the demand for participation in the devising, designing, deploying of these new social contracts is there. And there violently, brutally, there is a demand. So I think that in how we devise these ethical guidelines, these ethical principles, these frameworks, we need to consider that. It's very important. Otherwise, they are going to be rejected. The epistemic crisis is so deep across our democracies, is so deep across our infrastructures of trust that we cannot do without that. And the epistemic crisis is one in which citizens are diffident of any form of authority, scientific authority, economic authority, and obviously political authority. So we need to consider that. So, as I said before, ask not what UNESCO can do for you, but ask what you can do for UNESCO and with UNESCO. Well, this is our response. This AI Civic Forum, this platform for omni-stakeholder participation, where we really try and bring the citizen into that conversation using best practices, methodologies, tested tools. We are not doing this alone. It's an international partnership where we are working with Canada, for example, with MILA in Quebec, which is one of the leading centers in AI, founded by Yoshua Bengio, who is a recipient of the Alan Turing Award, along with Jan LeCun and Geoffrey Hinton. So the AI Civic Forum is there to empower people to shape the future of AI. And that's our response. It's not perfect, but that's a step forward. It relies on 4 pillars. One is AI literacy toolkit. If we are to bring people into the conversation, we need to empower them with an understanding of what this conversation is about, of what AI is about, what are its consequences. And that's a complex challenge. Why? Because in our view, AI literacy should be designed in a way that it empowers, that it emancipates the people. It's not there to discipline them into one vision of AI. And that's risky. That's, in a way, a tiny bit subversive. You want to bring them into a conversation so that they can express their voice, not in a way to tell them, okay, this is what AI is for you, you should do that. And that's not easy. But for us, this AI literacy is a very important part of the project, and we're right now developing the toolkit. Second is a caravan of consultations mixing face-to-face workshops and online aspects to crowdsource local perspectives and co-design these AI ethics principles. This co-designing process is very important. And we know that the digital divide runs deep. So wrapping ourselves into this ambition of an online consultation will not cut it. We really hope and want to go deep into the countries, to involve indigenous people into that conversations, to let them express what are their imaginaries over AI. What does that mean for them? And that cannot be done only by online consultation. We need face-to-face workshops, and also face-to-face workshops because, well, we are humans. For many people, AI is a subject for experts. Are you going to be able to compete with Facebook, with Twitter, with Snapchat, and bring them on your online consultation? Probably not. Because they feel that AI is not for them. I cannot blame them. I've been telling that to them for many years, because it's too complex. So we think that these participatory workshops, particularly the face-to-face workshops, are critical to build a relationship of trust and deploy in practice this empowerment. And it's not only for us. It's really, we hope to creating a kind of a self-sustaining endeavor. And that's why whenever we train, whenever we bring this capacity, we will do our best to train the trainer. So we are developing a playbook to train the trainer and make this viral. This conversation will not end. It has to continue. It has to continue over the years, even beyond the stabilization of the standard setting instrument with UNESCO, because these questions will arise again for other emerging technologies. Gene editing, neurotechnologies, they are going to continuously disrupt the social fabric and cause and force us to reinvent our social contracts. That's why in this Train the Trainer playbook to empower local communities to carry the conversation forward is very important to us. But we know that this won't be sufficient. Again, we're not naive. A text, however good, however perfect, without the right context, doesn't cut it. Devising the right kind of ethical governance will require, as I said before, building infrastructure of trust. If you have the right kind of ethical guidelines, you still need to enforce them. And the enforcement challenge is a key challenge in terms of regulatory capability building. And what lies ahead for societies across Latin America, but around the world, is really an effort to invent the right kind of mix across the stack of governance, mixing hard regulation, soft regulation, and self-regulation. And that requires capability building. Brazil and the rest of Latin America will need to devise what kind of hard regulation it requires in terms of data governance, for example, in terms of algorithmic accountability. You cannot place the responsibility, the onus, only on economic actors and say, well, you self-regulate. Well, in parallel, you submit them to huge economic competition, to a cutthroat economic competition. The responsibility of governments in this global competition on AI and digital is to, in a way, safeguard and empower economic actors to raise to the ethical top, not to the ethical bottom. And that requires hard regulation, not everywhere, but it requires hard regulation. Self-regulation can be effective, can be manifest, only if it's supported by a set of hard regulation. And the same for soft regulation. As I mentioned before, we are going to need and require technical standards, auditability standards, across the board. And that soft regulation is very important. So inventing the right mix of hard, soft, and self-regulation, and building capability to deliver on it in terms of, again, independent agencies, in terms of courts, in terms of civil servants at the working level and the managerial level to be able to adjudicate matters over the collection, the processing, the circulation of certain data, and especially moving the focus away from simply data collection into processing, into algorithmic processing. In Europe, in the US, there are big questions on the table in terms of how do we deliver that capability building effort? Should we empower data protection agencies with new competence to move into the age of algorithmic processing? And what I mean by competence, it's obviously competence, knowledge, but also resource, capability, computing capabilities. If you have a new competence and authorization to investigate algorithmic processing, what do you have in terms of computing capability to go out there in Google or Alibaba and say, well, you show me the code, I want to hold it right now, to be able to then enforce the legislation, to create trust. If you don't do that, well, citizens down the line are going to not trust the system. And when they lose trust, and if we fail at delivering this trustworthy adoption of AI, it's going to be difficult to move from principles into practice. And that's just one example. There are many, many other examples in terms of standardization again. Who is in charge? What is the trusted third party in charge of validating standards? Well, in the US, for example, there is the National Institute for Science and Technology, NIST, a globally recognized agent which is there to benchmark technologies and to create, as a trusted third party, trust across the landscape of economic actors over what is a good technology, what is a functional technology, and not so functional technology. What will Latin America do in terms of capability building to build its own standards? And the question is also posed on the table of Europeans, for example. So that's what I mean by capability building. It's not easy, but that's very important. And last but not the least, I think in terms of policy making, we really need to shift, upgrade the methodology. We've been focused too much on these principles and moving from principles to practice. While we know that good principles emerge out of a granular understanding of practices. So it's really about engineering positive feedback loops over the years between principles and practice. And that should not stop. And that's one thing that the high-level expert group of the European Commission learned. That they started devising principles and discovered down the line that those principles would become more effective, more meaningful if they were built on top of use cases that were relevant for Europeans. Well, the same apply to Brazil and Latin America. Agriculture, access to healthcare, and all these things, focusing on these use cases and resolving the ethical tensions on the use case will help you build more solid principles that will then be taken into efficient practice, supported by effective capability building on regulation. That's how you build and deliver the infrastructure of trust that your citizens, that our citizens deserve. So these feedback loops are very important. And when we think about devising a right legislative instrument, I think we need to focus a little bit more on these kind of feedback loops. Not so much the what, but the how. And I'll stop there. Thanking you very much again. Yeah. Oh yeah, thanks.
So what a better way to start the morning, even better than coffee, listening to Nicolas Miaillet speak. I know that now everybody is awake and engaged with a lot of the questions that were asked. Several points that you made struck me very deeply. This notion of text without context and the danger of text without context. And this goes back to a lot of the recommendations that were made in the panels yesterday, saying that policies and principles have to be based on use cases. And this means that we need to reimagine the way in which we develop public policies, and that the top-down approach no longer works. And this is where your feedback loop of top-down, bottom-up simultaneously is absolutely crucial. And this means that organizations like UNESCO and the OECD need to ensure this, what we call the Glocal Approach, which is making sure that we have a global and a local approach, and that we are getting input from the local level. And one of the added values of UNESCO in this regard is our incredibly dynamic field office network. And this is one of the comparative advantages of our organization. And I'd just like to salute many colleagues, including several directors, both from Montevideo, Kingston, and Brasilia, as well as the colleagues that are here, because the work that UNESCO will be undertaking in developing this standard-setting instrument will rely largely on our field office network and input on the ground, so that what we are developing is something that can not only be adapted at the national level and regional level, but in fact comes from input from the national, local, and regional levels. You also mentioned what UNESCO can do for us, how we should rethink it and say, okay, well, what can we do for UNESCO? And here I would like to launch a very public call because, as you said, we will be undertaking this AI Civic Forum with the Future Society, as well as the Quebec Institute for Artificial Intelligence and the University of Montreal. And in this regard, we hope that everybody in the room in your respective networks will both participate in the online consultations, but also in the regional and national consultations we will be undertaking in partnership with our field offices. You mentioned also this idea that algorithms are not intelligent, that they are very stupid statistical models. And in a lot of the forums that we undertake, there's a comment that comes out very frequently, which is we're talking about artificial intelligence and we're also talking about human stupidity. And this is a huge issue, and also an incredible opportunity, and we will talk about it later in the session on algorithmic bias and transparency, is that what these algorithms do, in fact, is they magnify the biases that exist already in our societies. And this is an opportunity to address it not only in the production of these algorithms, but also the biases that exist in our societies and every day. So we are right now, due to artificial intelligence, in front of a mirror of ourselves, where all of the worst parts of our societies are magnified. And this is a great opportunity, specifically as it concerns issues such as gender equality, exclusion, marginalized groups, to redress this, both in the technologies that we are developing, but also in our societies. I'd also like to underline, lastly, a point that you made as it concerns the comparative advantages of different organizations working in this ecosystem. The OECD and UNESCO, for example, very concretely, have complementary mandates. The OECD is working on upstream policy advice with a focus, as you mentioned, on economic aspects. UNESCO has a very specific mandate as it concerns our field of competencies and our global priorities, and we are working together hand in hand. And this is the way forward, is to see the complementarities in the international organization ecosystem, but also at the local level in the different communities, so that we can build consensus from the ground up and make an informed policy and guidelines that can be implemented that have the input necessary from stakeholders around the world. So thank you very much for underlining the necessity of this omni-stakeholder approach. This word is coming back on multiple occasions and I think is going viral on Twitter, thanks to Moez Shakshuka and Demi Getchko's conversation yesterday. And this is really an approach that we intend to adopt going forward. Before moving to the next panel on artificial intelligence and the future of scientific research and environmental management, I would like to invite you to listen to a couple words from Yaniv Gelnik on AI, drone technology, and sustainable development, directly relevant to the next panel and the questions that we will be addressing.
I think about automation, I think about scalability, and I think about dynamism. Most of the countries that have access problems, you have a combination of either really poor road infrastructure, or you have areas that have roads that are not year-round, and so there's extreme weather that makes the place temporarily inaccessible. And even in good days, it could be hours and hours to get there. With drones, the average delivery time is 15 minutes. So we take an area that could have taken days to get to by foot in the past, and we've now reduced that amount of time to only about 15 minutes. By having the drones completely autonomous, where they're flying themselves and they're speaking to each other and they're coordinating with each other, and when there are extreme weather conditions, each of them has the ability to adjust to that and to communicate in real time across the entire network in a way that humans would never be able to do quickly enough to make it safe. So once you use artificial intelligence to make the drones fly, you can use them for all kinds of things. Today we use it to deliver blood, medicine, vaccines, but tomorrow those same exact drone systems can be used to video World Heritage sites as you're trying to identify changes over time, or to try to monitor population movements or agricultural developments. So as UNESCO thinks about the World Heritage sites, some of which are located in conflict zones, which might not be as accessible, it's extremely affordable and efficient to send a drone to those areas from time to time to be able to give you a sense of what's happening on the ground, what changes there might be happening over time as a result of the conflict, without putting anyone in danger to go and check themselves.
So Yaniv Gelnik is talking about the potential